Hello and welcome to Ask Your Academic. Today's session will cover the MSc MedSci Clinical Neuropsychology and the Clinical Neuropsychology Knowledge and Practice. We're joined by our programme lead and he's here to answer any questions that you might have about the programmes. We've got a number of questions that have been submitted beforehand, so we'll do our best to answer all of those. We've also got our chat box, so if you've got any additional questions throughout today's session, just pop them in there. You can also use that to say hello and let us know where you're watching from. If after the session you've got any additional questions, you can email the administration team and they'll get back to you, and those details can be found on the web pages of our website, and they're in near the top of the page in a blue box. We are recording today's session, so that will be made available to you in the next few days. And yeah, so we only have a short session, so if it's all right with everybody, we'll get started. So first off, Jon, would you mind introducing yourself and giving us a bit of an overview of the different programmes that you run?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Naomi. So my name is Jon Evans. So I am Professor of Clinical Neuropsychology here at the University of Glasgow, based in the School of Health and Wellbeing. So we run the Clinical Neuropsychology suite of programs. So actually we have a variety. It's somewhat complicated because we have different programs. But I guess the first thing to say is that these programs are essentially designed for people with an existing qualification in clinical psychology. So it's part of specialist training for people who are qualified clinical psychologists who are then specializing in the field of clinical neuropsychology. So I run the program together with my colleagues, Jean McFarlane, who is our clinical practice director, and Jess Fish, who is our research director, and Helen Swanson is our one of our clinical tutors. So as I say, there are actually a number of different programs. So the specialist training in clinical neuropsychology, I guess, is divided into two main components, which is the knowledge component and then the practice component. So the knowledge component is primarily taught through the postgraduate diploma in clinical neuropsychology. So that's basically 8 taught courses, which most people take over a 2-year period. And then the clinical practice part is an additional qualification, which you can take either together with the knowledge, and that's wrapped up as the MSc Clinical Neuropsychology Knowledge and Practice, or quite a few people actually take them separately. So do the knowledge component, and then perhaps back and do the practice component. The other thing to point out is we also have what we call the MSc Applied Neuropsychology. And this is primarily designed for people who have qualified in clinical psychology outside of the UK. So our other programs are primarily for those who are qualified in clinical psychology in the UK, partly because these programs are accredited by the British Psychological Society to provide the specialist training. So if you've qualified in clinical psychology outside the UK, then you would do the MSc Applied Neuropsychology. So all a bit complicated, but it does sort of make sense.
Perfect, thank you. And can you tell us more about the sort of project element of those programs? So we get a lot of people asking, like, how does the research proposal work? Do we sort of pick our own topic? Do we choose our own supervisor? Is there a list of projects that we choose from? Could you tell us a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the project element, again, I suppose it sort of varies. So if we start with, if you do an MSc Clinical Neuropsychology or the MSc Applied Neuropsychology, you do a project which may be an empirical research project where you go and collect data, again, in a topic related to clinical neuropsychology. Some people would choose to do a systematic review, a formal systematic review or meta-analysis of literature that's existing, or occasionally people may do a secondary data analysis project where perhaps there's some existing clinical data, and that data has not yet been analysed, and you may ask a new research question. So we're open to people participating, suggesting research, projects or areas of interest, and then linking with one of us as an academic supervisor. And some people actually then will have a field supervisor who may be a clinical psychologist who's engaged in the research in their own clinical service. So yes, flexibility there. For those people who are doing the MSc Knowledge and Practice, what you might call the project component, is actually a clinical practice portfolio. So that's a very substantial piece of work, which again is the sort of final part of the specialist training. So that involves collection of information on patient sort of cases that people have seen usually over a minimum of about 2 years. So cases, a case log, like people submit a portfolio that's a case log, a supervision log, 50 individual case summaries, so a slightly longer version, and then 6 detailed case reports. Those are each of those is around 4,000 words. So that's sort of packaged together as a portfolio of clinical neuropsychology practice, and that's assessed by a Viva exam, an oral examination.
Perfect. And I suppose September is fast approaching. How can students prepare for their studies? Is there any reading or anything they can do before it?
Yeah, so people are keen to start preparing. We have a handbook actually has some of the sort of core texts that we use. So there is information on there. I mean, for most people who are working clinically, who are going to start the program, they're sort of busy with their clinical work, so there isn't too much preparation to do. But I will be sending the timetables out to people who are starting with us in September shortly, so people get an idea of what's coming up in the first sort of 2 weeks. And that may be a lead in to say that the way that we teach this program is actually in intensive blocks of teaching. So, and the reason for that is that for most of the people who are doing the program, as I say, that most people are clinical psychologists who work in the health service around the UK, and so people come to Glasgow, or we now have the option for people to join remotely, but we're keen for as many people to actually come to Glasgow. And traditionally, obviously pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, we ran the blocks as 2-week blocks, so people would come and stay in Glasgow for 2 weeks, so 2 weeks of intensive teaching, and then back to their jobs, and then come again a few months later for the next 2-week block. So it's fairly sort of full-on intensive teaching for those 2 weeks. And each 2-week teaching block covers 2 courses. Again, they vary slightly in length. Some of them are sort of 5 days and 5 days, or 7 and 3. For slightly longer and slightly shorter courses, but each 2-week block covers two courses. So overall, there are 4 2-week blocks covering 8 courses to do.
Perfect. And just linked to that, we've just got a question came through there, asking, is the part-time course 1-week teaching blocks? How does the part-time work?
So most people who are doing it part-time actually do the course over 2 years, and so basically you do 2 2-week blocks each year. So as I said, there are four blocks in total, and so if you did it in 1 year, and again, most of the people who are doing the program don't do it in 1 year, because it's fairly full on. It might not sound it, but if you're working full-time in the NHS, but so our teaching blocks are basically 2 weeks in September, there's 2 weeks in November, 2 weeks in January, 2 weeks in March, and then the exams are in May. But most people, that would be if you did it in 1 year. And our international students who are sort of here with us full-time in Glasgow, they do that model. But for most of the people who are working in the health service around the UK, most people would do 2 weeks in September and 2 weeks in January, and then the exams in May. And then in the second year, 2 weeks in November, 2 weeks in March, and then again the exams. So sort of spaced out over a period of time. there's also the flexibility to actually, for some people, even that level of intensity is too much, or we don't have the funding available for it. So it is actually possible to do it over a longer period of time. So some people would do maybe just one or two, maybe 2 or 3 courses each year, and spread it out maybe over 3, sometimes 4 years.
Perfect. So there is a bit of flexibility there for people.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Can you tell us, you mentioned there about an exam, can you tell us more about how the different courses are assessed?
Yeah. So there are, as I said, there are 8 courses. 2 of them are assessed by a 5,000-word essay each one. So that's our we have one which a module course which is called sort of professional issues and research design. So that one has an essay attached to it, and then also we have a pediatric neurological conditions course, and that has an essay attached to it. Also, all the other 6 courses have exams attached to them, and those are actually done within the scope of four exams, but 2 of the exams have sort of 2 parts to them, covering 2 courses. So, but you can think of it as 6 exams. And the model of those exams tends to be, it's a sort of short essay type response. So you may have, so for example, if we take course 1, that has an exam, that exam lasts 2 hours in length. You have 10 questions to choose from, and you choose 6 from those 10 questions. So you've got about 15 to 20 minutes to sort of write your answers. So it's sort of short, tends to be sort of short essay style of answers.
Perfect. Another question that we've got there through the chat is just wanted to confirm that teaching is taking place in person, but also broadcast on sort of Teams or Zoom.
Yes, so we're hoping to encourage as many people as possible to attend in person, but for those who are not able to attend, we use Zoom for teaching them. So we do it simultaneously. But what we would expect is people to attend live. So that's an obligation, if you like. So you either attend in person or you attend Zoom on Zoom live. It's not something where we, obviously for those occasional episode if somebody's unwell or something and can't attend, they can use the recording to catch up. But the expectation is that people attend all of the sessions live, either live via Zoom or live in person.
Thank you. Again, if you have any other questions, pop them in. The other question I've got here is, do you have any advice for students who are preparing to start their MSc?
Gosh, yeah. I suppose just it's one of those things where there's a lot of work combining both the sort of course and clinical work. So it's sort of, I suppose it's sort of get yourself ready for that, and try and make sure that you've discussed with your line manager or something to make sure that there's some time in your week to sort of to do some study ideally. Lots of people find that difficult to get extra time in their working week, but it certainly makes a difference if possible. I think one of the things that we always say is the nature of these 2-week blocks is good because people get a chance to sort of step out of work for 2 weeks and really concentrate on and focus on the teaching. Again, one of the big advantages of sort of coming to Glasgow in person was such that people get to meet each other, form connections and networks of colleagues around the UK, and that's a very beneficial thing. But key, in a sense, it's about sort of switching off from your sort of day-to-day work and then really just sort of focusing on the learning, and that's a positive thing. I think if people are doing it remotely, that can be a bit harder. People feel the temptation to keep work going, or keep doing sort of keeping up with work emails or the occasional meeting and so on. But we very strongly encourage people to sort of take those blocks of study in proper study time and to really concentrate. because like I said, there's lots to learn, and actually it just takes a while to sort of get that all, to spend time doing that. So. Apologies. So I think that's sort of, really making that space to really concentrate on the teaching is a good thing, an important thing, because it's quite intensive teaching. For those who are doing the knowledge and practice, again, it's about thinking ahead and thinking about when you want to sort of start that, the practice element. So, like I said, it's possible to do everything in a two-year period. But we tend to encourage people either to do the knowledge and then to sort of collect their practice elements, or to at least stagger slightly, so maybe do it over 3 or 4 years. And that's the model that tends to work best for most people.
Perfect. Our chat box has exploded there with a few questions. So one of them is about the teaching. They've heard it's at Gartnavel Hospital. Whereabouts do students tend to stay? Is it hotels that they tend to stay round about that area, or is it out west? Do you know?
Yeah, so actually our School of Health and Wellbeing has just a few weeks back has just moved into a new building, which I'll when I send the timetable out very shortly, I'll tell people about that. So this is the Clarice Pears building, so it's a very nice building, and it's basically just right on the university site. So it's at the bottom of University Place. For anyone that knows or is looking up Glasgow, it's halfway down Byres Road by University Place. So it's on the main sort of university campus area. Again, for anyone that knows Glasgow, it's the old Western Infirmary site. So we're just there. So it's a fantastic location, really great building. So people have tended to stay around in sort of accommodation. Sometimes, because obviously it's done in these 2-week blocks. We've got actually some information about places where people have stayed in the past, but either one, I mean, it's not going to make too much difference because of where we were at Gartnavel. We were just a mile or two down the road, so the same areas, the west end of Glasgow. People have stayed in Airbnb type accommodation or hotel guest house accommodation, or but in that area, it's in the sort of around the university is going to be the place to stay.
Perfect. And another question we've got, I don't know if this is maybe more one that would be better handled sort of offline, but it's talking about applications and what supporting information is needed for applications.
So mainly, obviously for this, it depends which one, but for the MSc Clinical Neuropsychology, the Clinical Neuropsychology Knowledge and Practice, there essentially we need you need confirmation of a doctorate in clinical psychology and your HCPC, so it's the Health and Care Professions Council registration information, and then it's usually at least one reference. I think. So for those who are doing the applied neuropsychology program, so that's for people who have qualified overseas, again, we are looking for evidence of your clinical psychology training. We recognise that around the world, clinical psychology training, professional training is done in all sorts of different ways, and so but we need evidence of your clinical neuropsychology, your clinical psychology training. And ideally evidence of sort of experience in working in the field of clinical psychology. Sometimes that's best done through a CV. So we ask everyone for a CV, so we can see what working experience people have had. Like I say, this is very much a program. It's very much designed as a specialist training in clinical neuropsychology. So it's sort of coming on the back of experience of clinical psychology work and education. So those are the main things we're looking for. And obviously, university tends to ask for transcripts for courses and so on.
Yeah. There's another one here. I've heard you can use your clinical psychology doctorate thesis if it's in a relevant topic and within a certain number of years to make the PG DIP knowledge component into an MSc. Is that the case?
Not quite. So what the doctorate in clinical psychology thesis is for essentially is, this is where it gets really complicated. So in a sense, this professional training is geared to enabling people to join the British Psychological Society Specialist Register of Clinical Neuropsychologists. So in a sense, it's a register of people who had training in clinical neuropsychology, accredited training. Now, I talked about knowledge and practice before. So to enter the specialist register, you have to have the knowledge, which is the PG DIP, and then you have to have the practice, which is the either done as part of the MSc knowledge and practice, or separately as a postgraduate certificate in clinical neuropsychology practice. So that's the knowledge and practice. But for the specialist register, you also need research. Now that's the bit that your doctorate in clinical psychology thesis will count towards. So what happens is we provide you with a research exemption certificate, which basically says, so we if you've done your clinical psychology doctorate research in any topic, it doesn't have to be in neuropsychology, but so you've done your doctorate in clinical psychology research thesis within 8 years, I think it is, of starting the training, then we give you a research exemption certificate. So that, in a sense, is you're going to take that to the British Psychological Society and say, okay, I've got my knowledge, I've got my practice, and I have my research exemption certificate, and then that makes you eligible to join the register. If you have done your doctorate in clinical psychology a long time ago, we ask you to provide evidence that you may have kept up with research. So for example, in your work, if you've done research projects, or so for example, audit projects, or you've published something. So we ask you for, in a sense, evidence that you've kept up with research skills through in a variety of ways. So we ask you to submit that. And again, if that's all okay, then you get your research exemption certificate. If you did your doctorate in clinical psychology a long time ago and you haven't really been doing research in the meantime, then you may need to do a research project. And that sometimes requires you to do an MSc Clinical Neuropsychology, and then you would do your practice separately later. So occasionally people do that. Or you can potentially do a research project sort of independently, and again, we would then evaluate that for just your research exemption certificate. So basically, there's a variety of ways of doing it, and what I suggest, and obviously we talk through this at the beginning of the program. But if anybody has queries about that, then just let us know, and we can talk it through. It's sort of very complicated in lots of ways, but once you get your head around it, it makes sense. But yeah, that's how it works.
Thanks, John. We don't have any other questions, so we do have 5 minutes. So if you get anything else, please pop them in the chat box. While we're waiting on anything coming through, John, is there anything that you think is important to mention that's maybe not been asked or brought up?
Maybe one of the things. So again, if anybody's on who is actually a potential international student, like I said, that tends to be people who've done their clinical psychology but somewhere else in the world, and then tend to be in Glasgow for a full year. One thing to mention for those folk is because we have these teaching blocks of the 2 weeks, and then there's a big gap, if you like. Actually, for our international students, what we do is we have a weekly tutorial, and because we recognise that again the teaching blocks are fairly intensive, and there's lots of new things. So what we do is in the tutorials, in a sense, we go back through the topics that have been covered in that 2-week block, and we'll discuss those in more detail over the tutorial. So you get extra, in a sense, extra support between and contact with the program team, apart from just those 2-week blocks. So that's a key thing. Yeah, no, I think that's probably the main points. More questions?
There is another question there. Do you know when the course dates will be confirmed?
Yeah, so I can tell you right now. So the first teaching block starts on the 18th of September. So that's the 18th to the 29th of September. And as I said, the timetable's just being finalised just now, and that will come out fairly soon. So it's 18th to the 29th is the first 2-week block in September, and so that will cover 2 courses.
Perfect. And the handbook you mentioned, is that something that the programme will email directly to offer holders, I'm assuming?
Yes, yeah. Well, so hopefully quite a few people will have had a sort of previous version of say last year's one to get a sense of the course, but there'll be an updated one, yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all our questions covered, and we are just approaching 11:30. So thanks very much, Jon, for your time and for answering all those questions. It was lots of information. So as I said, the session it has been recorded, and we'll get that sent out to you. So if there's anything that you want to sort of go through again, try and get your head around, you can do that in your own time. And if you get any questions that you don't really have the answer to, please email the administration team, and they'll get back to you to help solve any questions you have. So yeah, thanks again everybody for joining. Thanks for your time, Jon. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you all soon in September. Thanks again.
Thanks very much. Bye. Bye.